Thank you very much for joining me this evening. I'm Don Kinzler, the NDSU Extension Horticulture Agent for Cass County. And I always enjoy these chats with you. And as I went through the names of those that were registered, gosh, so many of you are like old friends. And for any of you who are new to my webinar series, welcome. It's very nice to have you. And in case you're not familiar with the Zoom type webinar setup, your cameras are automatically off, so you don't have to worry about clicking on your camera. And also the audio of everyone is off, so it doesn't matter if a dog is barking in the background. And for any questions that you have, we'll reserve the questions till the end of our program. And you can either use the chat or the Q&A. I'll be checking both of those. So feel free to use whichever of those two you're most comfortable with. And now this evening, we're going to cover a lot of ground because we're going to talk about all the when-tos of gardening. We're going to take a walk around the yard and garden, and so there's a lot of when-tos to keep track of in gardening. And so what I'm going to do is to everyone that was registered, I'll also send the recording of tonight's program. So in case you uh, aren't able to write down all of the things that we talk about, I'll be sending the recording so then you can stop and pause it to write things down. So if you prefer just to listen along tonight, that's good. Or if you have a pencil and paper handy, that's good also. And so it's going to be interesting this evening to talk about these when-tos. By the way, this is the first time I've ever presented this program. It was brand new, and I created it especially for tonight's webinar so that I could discuss all of these things with you. And now, when we talk about gardening when-tos, when we think about it, much of gardening is when to. When should I start my tomato plants so they don't get too big? When is the best time to fertilize our lawns? When should I prune our lilacs? So many of the things that we talk about in gardening are when is the best time to do things. And now, as we go through tonight's program, there are really two different ways that we could talk about the when tos. We could take each segment of gardening, such as perennial gardening, and we could talk, okay, what do you do in a perennial garden in April and May, June, July, etc. And then, or we could talk about fruit growing. When is the best time on apples to prune? When should we spray? Or we could talk about house plants. The other way to do this would be to set a calendar, such as, okay, in March, what do we do with houseplants? What do we do in the vegetable garden? What do we do in fruit growing? And in April, what do we do with roses? What do we do in perennials, etc.? So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to do both ways. We're going to take each of the kind of gardening aspects, such as fruit growing and perennial gardening and houseplants. We're going to take each of those separately and go through the when-tos. And then towards the end, I've prepared a calendar. So in March, here are all the things you do. April, here are all the things we do. And so anyway, we're going to kind of do it both ways this evening. All right, let's get started. I don't know about you guys, but I'm looking forward to spring. And a beautiful day like today just it really starts making spring alive. And it's surprising. I'm already thinking all of the things that I want to get accomplished in March and April. And so it's going to be fun again, isn't it, to do this gardening? So tonight's program, we're going to go through 2025 here, and we're going to see when we should be doing all of these different things. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to take a look at when do you get some of our seeds started on houseplants. When is the best time to do some of the houseplant things? Vegetable gardening, such as tomato gardening, when should we start? When can we start? Trees and shrubs we're going to talk about. When is the best time to prune and plant. We're going to talk about apple trees. When do we do all the apple tree type things? And perennial gardening. For those of you that like perennial gardening, we've got the when-tos there. And of course, lawn growing. When do we do all the many lawn growing type things, the when-tos? And gosh, we have 202 of you joining this evening. So again, to those that may be just tuned in, welcome to all of you. It's great to have all of you visiting this evening. So again, we're going to go through each of these different kind of aspects of gardening and see the when-tos. And then the last portion of the program, we'll take a look at each of the individual months and see, okay, how do we put all of that into a calendar? And again, I will be sending the recording out to everyone who has registered. All right, let's start, first of all, when do we start seeds of flowers and vegetables? Now, I've got a couple things seeded already, begonias, because they take so very, very long to grow. And so I always start those in February. Now, each of the different types of flowers and vegetables have a different start time because each of the different types take a little longer to grow. For example, those begonias I mentioned, they take all the way from February until mid-May to get a plant large enough to plant out. So the end goal in seeding is to create a plant that is big enough to go outside into the garden or out into our flowering containers or flower beds sometime during the last half of May. You know, my gardening sweet spot is between about the 15th of May to the end of May, that 2-week period. So then we start our flower and vegetables indoors at the appropriate time to give them the number of weeks needed. All right. So if we take a look at some of these, and again, I'll be sending you the recording in which you can kind of pause this slide to write these down. But if we take kind of a look at some of the highlights, for example, March 1st, next week, I'll be seeding petunias. And March 15th, you can seed broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, peppers. Now, here's a big one, April 1st. That's when we start tomatoes. Now, a person might think, well, if I started the tomatoes, oh, by the way, I give a whole program on starting flowers and vegetables from seed, uh, but that's for another program. All right, so a person might think, well, why don't I start my tomatoes like now? Wouldn't I get a bigger plant and really get my tomatoes early? Well, if each of these types, such as tomato, are started too early, they just get large indoors, they get weak, they languish indoors from generally a lack of light, and they just get big and spindly. And so by following a calendar like this, it's created to produce the best plant for starting out. You know, you can vary it by a few days, certainly, but that works quite well. So now when can we plant outdoors? Well, no matter how early the spring is, I never trust an early spring because we frequently will get May frosts. And my sweet spot for planting, as I mentioned, is mid to late May. The chances of frost for most of our areas are minimized. Doesn't mean we won't get frost, but during that last part of May, as we approach the end of May, then the time to plant outside gets increasingly better. Now, as we go through some of these when-tos, again, we're focusing on the when do we do things. Almost each of these could make a whole webinar themselves. For example, houseplants. Yeah, I do a webinar on houseplants. But let's talk about the when-tos in houseplants. Okay, repotting. When should we repot houseplants? Well, a good time is in spring, and here's why. In springtime, our indoor plants do recognize that the days are getting longer. They can tell the light coming through our windows is longer than it was in late December. And so they'll oftentimes start a spurt of growth. So if in springtime here, starting now already, if we repot them they sense that growth is going to be starting. So it's a good time. Also, in the fall of the year, nice time. I like to pot some of our plants outdoors in the fall of the year because it kind of keeps some of the mess outside and then bring them in. Or really, whenever a houseplant needs repotting. Well, how do you tell if a houseplant needs repotting? Well, if you slip it out of the pot and if you almost see no free soil, but the entire root ball is all consumed with roots, then it's probably time to repot. All right, fertilizing house plants. Now, fertilizer is nutrition for helping plants grow even better. And then spring of the year here, when that light coming through the windows is longer, those plants can tell they're getting more light, and now they can use that extra nutrition to put a little extra growth on during these longer days that are approaching. So fertilizing in the spring is a good idea, and really monthly, March through September. As the days of fall start getting shorter and the plants can tell that, they oftentimes start doing less growing, and so less nutrition is needed through the winter months. Insect control on house plants. It seems the insects like to find the house plants almost any time of year, don't they? One product that I really like are the systemic house plant granules. These are sold at garden centers, and they're granules that you apply to the soil of the house plant. And the label tells for a certain diameter pot how much to add to that. And then as you water the plant, that systemic is taken down into the roots and it's taken internally into the plant. And then as those little sucking insects, such as aphids and spider mites and mealybugs, as they suck the plant sap, then it kills them. So it's quite a good way to control houseplants, insects. All right, next, let's quickly move to the vegetable gardens. Same thing as we mentioned with the flowers and things that we start indoors. When is it safe to plant out in our vegetable garden? Well, as I mentioned before, I never trust an early spring because I'm afraid what might happen in May. But there are some things that even in April we can plant, and they're called cool season crops. And the reason they're called that is they love it when it's cool. And also, most of them can tolerate frost. So we can plant these out in the garden. They love the cool soil. They'll sprout even when the soil is chilly. And even if they come up and we get a frost, they're okay, unless just the bottom really drops out. But uh, But anyway, a couple of types that really do well planted in April are things like radish, onions, lettuce, spinach, peas, potato, carrots, cabbage. They can all take quite a bit of chilly weather. The other type of vegetables are called warm season crops. These are crops that not only need warm soil in order to sprout, so planting them early usually results in failure because the soil is too cold and the seed would rot. They like warm soil, and they also are very sensitive to frost. So even if the temperature tickles around 32 degrees, they'll often be lost. Those are things like tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, cucumbers, melons, squash. So they're best delayed till the last half of May, somewhere between May 15th, May 25th, or even closer down towards Memorial Day works well. All right, next, let's go to the when-tos of the perennial flower garden. All right, there we see a perennial flower garden that is almost kind of this time of year after the snow disappears. But this is a perennial garden showing the tops left on over winter. And now someday I'm going to write a book about gardening terminology, all the kind of quirky terms that gardeners use that might not be intuitive to others. And one of those terms is the tops of perennials. Okay, you know, the top of a building is at the top of the building, but the tops of a perennial aren't just up at the top. The tops are everything from ground level on up. So in April, early April, we cut back the tops of the perennials. And so everything from the ground on up, I'd like to leave maybe about a 1 inch stub, but everything from that 1 inch on up gets cut back and removed. Now, there's some good reasons for leaving these tops intact on most perennials over winter. One of those is because they just survive winter better. They tend to catch snow, especially this year when we didn't have much snow. Also, there are many little native pollinating bees. And of course, they're important because they're going to make our apple crop and our cucumber crop much better. Those little native pollinating bees are oftentimes nesting inside those hollow stems. And another good reason for leaving these tops intact is they look actually pretty in the winter time. But in early April, we cut back those tops and they should be cut back before the new growth starts. So we have kind of a window in April, but sometime the end of April, first part of May, that new growth is going to start popping up out of the ground. And if you wait too long, that new growth, the new shoots coming up from the base, the green shoots are going to get mixed in with the dry stuff, and it's going to be tough to cut them back. This will sometimes happen with ornamental grasses. If you don't get them cut back down to about 1 inch above ground level, if you don't get them cut down early enough, the new grass shoots start coming up in the middle of that haystack, and then it can be a real job to try to get the old stuff taken off. And on ornamental grasses, that top should be taken off. All the old stuff, that old haystack there, should be cut off so that the new growth has good ability to emerge. All right. Now, in perennials, when do we dig and divide on these? Well, there's kind of a neat rule of thumb. If the perennial blooms in spring, you divide it in the fall. For example, think peonies. Okay, peonies bloom in May, maybe into early June, but generally kind of spring or summer. And so the time to dig and divide peonies is in the fall. September is really the month. And if you think another kind of early blooming one, iris, bloom in June usually. And so we do that more towards fall, August, September works well for that. All right. Conversely, if the perennial blooms in fall, you divide in spring, such as these mums, or also hosta. The hosta that you see there with the hand kind of being divided. Now, hosta bloom generally in the last half of summer when they do bloom towards fall. So a hosta and other types like that get divided in spring. I like to divide them, such as hosta, just as the new shoots are starting to emerge from the ground, because then you can see where you've got a nice live clump, and so that works well. So kind of to recap the digging and dividing of perennials, you choose the season opposite the bloom time. So most of us can kind of remember when these different perennials bloom generally. So choose the season opposite that. And the reason for that is this. When a perennial is blooming or close to blooming, that's when it's most sensitive. They do not want to be dug and divided and pulled apart and replanted when they're in full bloom. They're quite sensitive and tender at that time. So that's why we just try to get to the season opposite the bloom time on those. So it's a little bit easier to remember. Now, I oftentimes say that best, one of the best inventions in gardening was the plastic nursery pot, because that allowed perennials and trees and shrubs to be planted all summer long. Our local garden centers can have perennials in the plastic pots growing on their benches, ready for us to plant all summer long. And so perennials can really be planted in the springtime, summertime. Some can be planted in the fall as well. And so, gosh, aren't those allium, the ornamental onions, aren't those beautiful? Now, fertilizing perennials. Early May is a great time to give some fertilizer to perennials. It can be either granular type like the 10-10-10 or the water-soluble type that you would pour on. So perennials, give them a fertilizing in May and a second fertilizing about a month later in June. So perennials, we fertilize generally the first half of the growing season, once in May, once in June. And that will help build up the energy. All right, many perennials benefits from some winter mulch, especially if they're younger perennials, maybe ones that are planted the first year that don't have such an extensive root system. They benefit from a winter mulch. Could be straw, could be leaves, could be shredded bark mounded up around, and any that maybe are a little borderline in hardiness. Some of those things, such as the winter hardy hibiscus, is a little borderline in our area. It does quite well. If you've never tried the winter hardy hibiscus, they are beautiful. But again, they benefit from some winter mulch. Now, the timing of winter mulch is in the fall of the year when there's a little bit of frost in the ground, first part of November. Now, the idea of these protective mulches are to keep the ground comfortably frozen so that we don't get the freezing and thawing. So it's not necessarily to stop for a little bit of frost from going down in, but it's to keep the perennials comfortably frozen at just a nice temperature, and so that the frost doesn't go deeply, and so there's not a freezing and thawing that heaves the perennials out of the ground. So the target date um, for protecting, adding mulch to perennials is about the first part of November. Now, let's talk about trees and shrubs. On Queen Elizabeth, she enjoyed planting trees. Now, most of us dress a little more casually than she did when she did her tree planting, but I always enjoyed Queen Elizabeth, and she actually did enjoy planting trees. So trees and shrubs can be planted all season long, all summer, starting in the spring. If some of the garden centers have bare root, they can be certainly planted in the spring, and the potted material can be planted all the way up until about the end of September. That works well also. The cutoff is about September 30th, so that you have the entire month of October for the fall planted material to root in, and this would apply to both trees and shrubs. The soil in many of our areas starts to freeze down sometime the first part of November, or at least by mid-November. So we need the full month of October to be frost-free in the soil and to allow the roots to occur and to start growing. Now let's talk about tree pruning on these. Tree pruning. Late winter or early spring for most of our shade trees. We're going to get to apple pruning in just a minute. So most of our shade trees, late winter or early spring before new growth starts for most of the trees. Now, in the fascinating, look at the picture there. That was a well pruned tree branch. Notice the collar of growth, that ring of growth that has sealed off that pruning cut. And notice that it's the pruning cut was made just a little outside of flush. So if you take a look at that circular area next to the trunk, there's a raised area called the branch collar. So when you were pruning off this branch, instead of making a flush cut to the trunk, stay out just a hair so that you leave that branch collar, that little bit of a raised area, intact. And then, given a season or two, that branch collar contains the cell growth that will multiply and close off that wound. Isn't that neat, the way that it is protecting itself from insects and diseases going in? So late winter or early spring before growth starts is the preferred. Now, I think I saw an early question in the Q&A wondering on birch trees. Birch and maple are an exception to this rule, and here's why. Birch and maple, if pruned in late winter or early spring, start to ooze sap. That's why in early spring you can tap a maple for maple syrup. But if we do pruning at that time, there's a whole lot of maple ooze that comes down out of those cuts. So the preferred and recommended time of pruning, both birch and maple, is after some growth has started. After the leaves have popped out and started to expand, then you can go ahead and prune, and then you won't get all the sap oozing out on those. So birch and maple, a little bit of a an exception to the late winter or early spring. Now, this applies to pruning of trees. It also applies to pruning of shrubs. So late winter or early spring before growth starts is when our leafy deciduous shrubs are best pruned. Fall pruning is not really recommended on trees or shrubs. And now, don't worry if you did prune some of your things last fall. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to die. But here's the reason for not pruning in the fall. When we prune in the fall of the year, the tree or shrub growth is coming to an end in preparation for winter time. And the cell growth isn't expanding, cells aren't multiplying, and that cut surface does not heal over. Um, and so that pruning cut is left open and exposed during the winter time, and it's exposed to the drying winds of winter time. There's more chance of some dieback. There's just more chance of something going wrong. There's not a good reason for pruning in the fall. And so instead, that's why we prune in late winter or early spring, closer to the time when new growth is going to be starting, because as soon as the new growth starts, then cells start dividing and they can close off those pruning wounds and less chance of something going wrong. Now, our forestry departments, of course, in cities, they've got a lot of trees to prune, and so they start pruning all winter long. But they're pruning rock hardy, established trees and things so they can get by. That works well for them. But for most of our home yard trees and shrubs, late winter, early spring, and skip the fall pruning. I guess one reason for doing fall pruning is if the shrubs are leaning over your sidewalk and you aren't going to be able to get the snow, uh, if you're not able, to shovel and get the snow blower through, well, then of course, then we do need to do some fall pruning. But I hope that kind of answers the question on fall pruning versus late winter pruning. Okay, let's talk about some of the when-tos in roses. And roses are fun to grow. The rose pictured there is one called Campfire Rose. It's beautiful. Sold at garden centers. It was developed in Canada. It has wintered well for us for many years without any extra winter cover at all. So rose pruning should be done about April 1st. Again, they tend to winter generally better if they're not pruned in fall, but leave the branches intact. And then about April 1st, do the pruning on those. Roses love to be pruned. And of course, I do a whole program on roses. Roses love to be pruned. You can cut them back by at least half, maybe even 2/3. Kind of get out all the tangle and get them down to just some of the main canes, and they bloom better on fresh wood. And so that's why that's a reason for giving roses a really good hard pruning, is because it stimulates much fresher, nicer growth once growth does start, and they bloom better on that type of wood. Roses respond so very well to fertilizing. So fertilize in May and then fertilize again in June. Now you could use a rose type fertilizer. Or you could use the regular 10-10-10 all-purpose, or a person could use water-soluble type. But fertilize kind of in the early part of May as growth is starting, and then fertilize again the early part of June on roses. Now, deadhead, that's another one of those good gardening terms. Deadhead means removing the spent blossoms, the withered blossoms. So roses will continue to send out another flush of blossoms, most types, if you prune off that dead flower, once it's withered. But that should stop about August. From August on, let the spent flowers remain. They'll oftentimes create rose hips, which is the little, almost like a little miniature apple on a rose. And that helps to kind of toughen in the roses. So we deadhead about until August. And then from August on, they'll usually give another flush of blooms. But by that point, just let the roses kind of do their thing, and they tend to winter better than if we do too much trimming on them after August. And then any tender types that a person might have, we need to put a little protection around those starting about November 1st. Many of the tender type roses, such as the nice hybrid teas. Next, let's talk about fruit growing. And of course, apples are the number one fruit in our area that requires a little bit of work for us, but it's well worth it. So one of the most common questions about apples in the home yard is, when do we spray to prevent insect problems? Well, there are about 3 reasons that we spray our apple trees. And the first is for the codling moth, which is pictured there. Doesn't that make a mess? That codling moth lays eggs on the developing fruit, which hatch into a larvae that tunnels in and just makes a mess internally in that apple. Now, the codling moth is active right after blossom drop. So in May, as soon as the flowers fall, that's the time to spray. Now, the nice thing about the timing of this is the spray that a person applies to get rid of the codling moth. At that point, the insects, the pollinating insects, our bees, are no longer visiting that apple tree because the blossoms are all gone. So timing is good. So now the product that we would use for spraying these, again, we do a whole program on apple raising. But just real briefly, the product that a person would use for these insects and diseases, I like to use an all-purpose orchard spray. You can buy those at garden centers. And the all-purpose orchard spray, or home orchard spray, sometimes they're called, has an insecticide and a fungicide also. So the codling moth will oftentimes be on that label, or should be on that label, so look for it. Codling moth creates the damage as seen there. Now, the apple maggot, very, very common. Notice the damage that it does. The apple maggot often isn't identified, or you don't know you've got apple maggot problem until you go to harvest the apples, and then you cut into them and they've got all these brown streaks inside. That's caused by the apple maggot. The apple maggot fly, it's kind of a little blackish fly. The apple maggot adult fly lays its eggs on the developing fruit somewhere between about late June and early July. Each year depends on what the weather's been, how warm it's been, etc. So the apple maggot that don't fly punctures the skin of the fruit and lays an egg or many eggs, and that egg hatches into a little larvae that causes all those brown streaks. By harvest time, that larvae is usually already exited the apple, but leaving behind all the damage. So the time to start spraying for apple maggot, again, is in late June or early July. I like the home orchard spray, again, because it's kind of an all-purpose, or just check the insecticides at the garden center and check the back of the label for apple maggot control. One organic product that works quite well is one called Spinosad, Spinosad. Spinosad works quite well on apple maggot control. One spray alone does not always provide enough enough control because the apple maggot flies continue to lay eggs all the way up until August. So usually a person needs to do about 3, maybe 4 sprays. Check the label to see. Oftentimes it'll indicate at 10 to 14 day intervals. So do check the label for how often to reapply and any directions. Now, the third thing that we spray our apple trees for is apple scab. Now, apple scab affects both the leaves, as you can see here, and also the fruit. Apple scab was very bad last year. We had such a wet early spring and early summer, and it was just a petri dish for foliage type diseases. So many ornamental crab apples were defoliated by apple scab. And so you might want to keep your eye out early because the fungicide for apple scab, again, a home orchard spray or a fungicide that lists apple scab, that needs to be applied while the foliage is still healthy and green. Once the leaves have started to turn yellow and drop and are all spotted, it's too late. And because last year was so devastating on many apple trees and crab apple trees, we need to be on the lookout because oftentimes these fungal type diseases will come back and repeat. Again, it depends on the weather, but they'll come back because there's a lot of inoculum or there's a lot of these fungus organisms in our local atmospheres. All right, next on apple trees is thinning the fruit. So the next when to on apples is when should we thin these fruits? Well, first of all, we might say, well, why would you thin out the fruit? Why do you want to remove any of the fruit? Well, when the little fruits are dime size, kind of about like the picture shows, there's just too many apples in a cluster. And that's how apple blossoms form. They tend to form in clusters. And then if each of those blossoms gets pollinated, they result in these little clusters of fruit. And the fruits just basically outcompete themselves. They can become too heavy on a branch. And also, that competition makes the fruits smaller and they may not be as sweet or as high a quality because the tree has to spread its resources out over too many. So even commercial orchards will remove some of these fruits because they want good quality apples. And so anyway, when the fruits are dime size, you just by hand remove some of the fruits and space them so that they're about anywhere from 3 to 4 inches, 3 to 6 inches apart. What we want to avoid is the cluster of apples such as that. You can just almost feel that that branch is ready to break. And then the apples aren't going to be as good a quality either. So thinning is quite important actually for the apple trees. When to harvest? How do we know when to pick our apple trees? Well, there are a couple of good clues. First of all, if you know the named cultivar of apple, each of the apple cultivars has a specific window in which they ripen. Some apples are kind of early season apples. Some are in the middle, such as September. Others are late in the season, such as Haralson. So Haralson, we know, can hang on the tree kind of way up into October. They actually become higher quality and sweeter. So a Haralson apple will almost never be ripened in August, whereas a variety such as Hazen will never hang onto the tree until October, or rarely. They're ready in August. So knowing the cultivar is important, but if you don't know what that name is, a couple of ways you can check. If we look for the background color, that's the non-red color. The background color should change from a green to more of a creamy color. And if you cut a sample apple open, the seeds should be blackish brown. And there will usually be a few fruits dropping. And then, of course, taste. If it seems like it tastes pretty good to you, then we can go ahead. Pruning of apples is a big when too. Now, if you take a look at the photo there, that's a classic fire blight example. It's a bacteria disease, which can be spread by pruning. And if we prune during the active growing season when those bacteria are active, our pruning can spread it from one branch to another. And so that's certainly not good. So the customary apple pruning time has usually been late winter or early spring before trees start growth. So that's the customary. But there is also a serious disease called black rot and very devastating on apple trees. And there's kind of a new way of thinking of apple pruning, since this black rot is becoming such a devastating problem. There are many indications that we should maybe on apple trees wait to prune until actually they've started growing a little bit, because at that time, these cells are going to close off the pruning wounds a little faster. And so anyway, a good plant pathology friend of mine is really looking closely that we should be recommending apple pruning after the leaves have started to come out a little bit. Because actually we tend to see more black rot than we do fire blight. But again, if you've had any fire blight problems, that needs to be pruned out during the dormant season. Okay, the next when to on apples is to wrap the trunks of the trees November 1st and then remove it about April 1st. Very important to remove it for the summer growing season so that the trunks of the trees can get sunlight and air exposure. Next, we're going to talk about the lawn when-tos. And here we've got a nice, and again, I'll be sending this out to you so you can kind of take a closer look at that slide. A couple of things here we see um, aerating, late April through May. It's a good time to aerate. Dethatching, that can wait until fall. So anyway, let's talk about some of these a little closer. Okay, crabgrass preventer. Crabgrass preventer should be in place around April 15th. Easy way to remember that is around tax day. Okay, next, if we need to thicken up our lawns, we need to do some seeding in May after the soil warms. If we seed too early, the grass seed is just going to sit there and be food for sparrows. The soil needs to warm to 50 to 55 degrees or so before that seed will start to sprout. So we may as well delay our seeding. Instead of seeding in April, may as well delay until May so that the soil has warmed and that grass seed can take right off. An alternative to seeding is to wait late summer or early September, before September 15th. The late summer or early September seeding really works quite well. That is actually the number one time to seed. But again, rather than waiting till then, we can seed in May. Okay, fertilizing. The number one time to fertilize a lawn has actually been shown for Labor Day. Now, I am doing 4 webinars. Tonight's the first night. And so the next 3 Mondays after this, I'm doing a webinar. And one of those is totally on lawn care, how to get a nice green lawn with less work. And so I'm going to send the registrations for all of those out to you. So we'll talk more about lawns during that. But anyway, the primary number one time to fertilize a lawn is actually Labor Day, and the secondary is around Memorial Day. Now, when fertilizing is just a little side note, when I'm fertilizing, there are 2 types of spreaders. One on the left is called the cyclone spreader, which tends to kind of throw out the fertilizer out in a cyclone pattern. The only problem with that is I find that you get it all over your driveway and sidewalks and then have to sweep it off. I prefer the drop type seeder, which is on the right there, and that just drops the fertilizer straight down. And then I don't get as much on the sidewalk, and I kind of like that. Core aeration, which is the process you see right here, in which the machine lifts up little plugs. And again, when we do our lawn, lawn webinar, we'll talk all about the why and how to know if your lawn would benefit from this. But core aeration can be done either in May or September. And also the power raking or dethatching, May or again in August, September. But in dethatching or power raking, in the spring of the year, the lawn needs to firm up and begin some actual active growth. So that's why May, even mid-May. April is too early. Because the lawn is kind of wet and tender, and power raking can actually tear up the grass a little too vigorously. So anyway, we delay the power raking until further into May when the grass is actually green and growing and toughened in. All right, what about geranium cuttings? Late August is a perfect time to start the geranium cuttings that you're going to winter and use the following spring. If you've got geraniums now, you could certainly start some cuttings now. But August seems to work really, really well. Okay, so that was a very quick overview in kind of each of those gardening segments. And now I promised you that we would also take a look month by month. Now, I don't like slides in which there's so much verbiage because it's so hard to read it all. But I wanted to go through each of these months and make a list of the things that a person that we gardeners do in each of those months. So when I send you the recording of this, you'll kind of have this calendar. But let's just quickly go through these. Okay, so coming up on the month of March here. Okay, so here's the things we need to accomplish in March. Okay, trim back the geraniums you've wintered to about 3 inches. Begin fertilizing your geraniums and other wintered plants and house plants. Okay, March 1st, seed petunias and some of the other flowers. March 15th, seed peppers. All right, April. April's a busy month in the yard and garden. Okay, about April 1st, start pruning your deciduous trees, shrubs, roses before new growth starts. April 1st, start tomato seeds. First part of April, cut back the tops of perennials that we mentioned. Clematis, if you've got a clematis vine, April's the time to cut it back to just a little bit above soil line because clematis generally dies back to soil line or just a little above. Rake when the lawn gets dry. Tax day, April 15th, apply crabgrass preventer. About April 15th, you can start zinnia seeds. April, remove your tree wraps. You can even kind of in the middle of April or end of April, plant the cool season crops that I mentioned. See how we're kind of recapping again by each month what we do. All right. First part of May, you can start melons, cucumbers, squash by seed early indoors. The first part of May, just as a little bit of new growth is starting on perennials, that's a good time to dig and divide, such as the hosta we mentioned. Now, in May, fertilize the tulips while they're still blooming in your flower beds or landscapes because they need nutrition to come back the following year and bloom. So fertilize tulips, very important, while still blooming. In May, like we mentioned, aerate or power rake the lawn, seed grass, and then spray apple trees when the blossoms drop, as I mentioned, for codling moth. Remove the tree wraps for summer if you didn't do it in April. Let's see. Fertilize perennials and roses in May. Prune evergreens May through June. Around Memorial Day, fertilize the lawn. And of course, spray for weeds as they are starting to pop up. Now in June, the listing for the calendar. Remember to set your mowing height to 3 inches for a late spring and starting in summer. In mid-June, treat for squash vine borer. All right. See, each of these, I could talk almost a whole program on some of these things. About June 20th on the calendar here, spray the apple trees for apple maggot control, like I mentioned. In June, after the peonies and iris are done blooming, deadhead those, remove the old spent flowers so they don't start setting seed because the seed takes away from the strength and energy. And we mentioned thinning apples when they're about dime size to 3 to 6 inches apart. Now the photo, they're maybe a little bit crowded there yet. Okay. And any apple trees that are less than 5 years old, you really should remove the tiny apples. I know it's a shame because we all want the first bites of apples, even though the trees are young. But the commercial orchard growers who are serious about their apple trees, they remove those apples that form too early. They want the strength to go into the apple tree, and they don't want those couple little first early apples that are going to sap strength out of the tree. So grit your teeth and take off those tiny little first apples before they form on your young apple trees. And in June, fertilize perennials and roses again, as you did in May. Now, July 4th. July 4th is actually called Independence Day for gardeners because there are a couple things we can stop doing. Okay, the harvest of asparagus and rhubarb generally should stop. So for the last half of the growing season, you let the plant replenish itself after we've plucked off all its leaves and stems. Now, it's not going to kill it if you enjoy a rhubarb pie, the last half of the season, but generally, the harvest of those should kind of stop or taper off July 4th. Okay, July 4th, also Independence Day for gardeners. We don't fertilize our roses, trees, shrubs after July 4th. They've got enough nutrition at that point, and fertilizing the last half of the season can stimulate new growth that might not have time to toughen in. So in the vegetable garden, in early July, hill up soil around the potato plants so that the developing tubers aren't too close to the top, otherwise they turn green. And mulch tomatoes in the garden. Mulch those, that's the best way to prevent blossom end rot. We could do a whole webinar on tomatoes, certainly. Okay, in July, continue to fertilize your pots and planters, deadhead roses. Now, August. August is a busy time. Dig and divide iris every 4 to 5 years. Continue to fertilize geraniums and container plants. Even though we don't fertilize our trees, shrubs, and perennials the last half, our pots and planters can keep blooming through October if we give them enough nutrition. Take geranium cuttings in late August. Again, we can power rake or dethatch our lawn. Okay, September, and again, I hope these kind of calendars are going to be helpful for you. So in September, and again, I know this is too much to kind of write all this down, and that's why I'm going to be sending you the recording so that you can just kind of slowly pause and write some of these down if you wish. So September, Labor Day, the main time of year to fertilize the lawn. And you can seed lawns up to middle of September. September's the time. Dig and divide peony, bleeding heart, lily, daylily. Plant tulips and daffodils. You can corate or power rake lawn in early September. And of course, plant trees and shrubs all month. October, garlic gets planted in October. Remember to water evergreens if it's dry. Collect any seed off of flowers or vegetables that you'd like to do. October's time to cut back the tops of peonies or other diseased perennials. We talked about leaving the tops on other things, but peonies and anything that's diseased should be taken off. Also, in that same category, iris, daylilies, hosta, cut those tops off after frost because they just turn to mush over winter. All the other tops of perennials leave intact. Now you see a photo there of asparagus. Leave asparagus tops intact because they winter better that way, and then cut them back in early spring. Rhubarb leaves, because the whole rhubarb plant just turns to mush after a frost. And because rhubarb leaves and stems can have leaf diseases that winter on that old stuff, after the leaves have kind of turned to mush and withered all down, just remove the leaves and stems after a frost. Okay, in October, you can give one last low mowing on your lawn. And then, of course, if you wanted to dormant seed a lawn, the end of October. November, there's still a few things to do. Wrap the fruit trees if you haven't already. Apply protective mulch to perennials, as we mentioned. Wire fencing for rabbits. Boy, the rabbits in November were getting hungry on our stuff, so we put a lot of chicken wire around things and mulching strawberries. So that is a quick overview of all the when-tos, and we'll start questions here quickly. If anyone needs to depart, I totally understand, but we'll start the questions. It looks like there's approximately maybe 20 some questions. We'll get to those in just a minute. Now, next Monday night, the second in our webinar series is your best flowering containers ever. And I will send all of you the link to register for that as well. And so that is also next Monday, 7 p.m. So we're going to talk about all the ways that we can get our flowering containers to do even a little better. I enjoy doing a gardening podcast. It's called Growing Together, a gardening podcast. If you just simply Google that, you'll find the whole list. We do that every week, and we just passed 100 episodes. Okay, and I'm going to leave my contact information there up on the screen, and let's take a look at the questions. And you can continue to add questions. I'm going to do the chat first, then I'll do the Q&A. Okay, let's get to the top here. When do you start? When do you start peppers? And by our peppers, or by our seed starting calendar, that's approximately March 15th. Works quite well. Okay, and would you please tell people that the Master Gardener Seed Library will be available at the main library and the Carlson branches of the Fargo Public Library beginning on April 2nd. Yes, and so the Master Gardeners, and thank you, Anne, for mentioning it, Master Gardeners package seeds, and you can go to the library and get free seeds from the seed library there. So visit the Fargo Public Libraries, both the main and the Carlson Library. What about pruning evergreens? When is the recommended time? So evergreens, instead of pruning early, kind of the dormant season, evergreens in May and June. I now have a rabbit chewing on one of my climbing roses. What works best? Chicken wire and hardware cloth are my go-tos. Okay, you might hear, putting out, pepper, hot pepper, but some rabbits, it seems they maybe like hot sauce. What works for some of these home remedies, and pepper is actually one of them, Irish spring soap, human hair, and different mothballs, they don't seem to work for everyone enough. Although pepper does seem to work pretty good. But there are two repellents, if you go the repellent route, two repellents that do work better than others. Let's make that three. One is liquid fence, one is plant skid, PLANTSKYDD, plant skid, and another is Repel X. Those three have some research behind them that have the broadest appeal. Now, no repellents are going to be 100%, and they do need to be reapplied. But liquid fence, plant skid, and Repel X are the three best. Okay, and also rabbits get very hungry this time of year. When the snow disappears, they'll have some other things to munch on, but boy, until they have some alternative food sources, they go for roses and shrubs and anything. Does the fruit calendar, such as apples, apply to other fruits as well, such as pear trees? Yes, you can spray them very much as you did apples. Are apple trees 5 years old, counting from transplanting from garden or from seedling? That's a great question. Yeah, so when we say remove the little apples for the until the tree gets 5 years old, basically that is from when you planted that tree. So when we say that most apple trees begin bearing 5 to 7 years from, and that's from planting. It's not from when they were started as a seedling or a graft. So anytime you see in literature that it will take 5 to 7 years for that to bear fruit, generally that's from the time you plant that tree, because give or take, most of the fruit trees are about the same age minus a year or two. My plum tree had a thick web with worms in it, and they're called web worms. So look for an insecticide at the garden center that has web worms on, and you need to penetrate that web. So with a long stick, try to wind around. Sometimes you can just catch the whole net with the worms intact and then toss it in the garbage, but try to penetrate that nest, and if you can get a stream of insecticide into that, then that's the trick. Can that potted insecticide be used with indoor edible plants like herbs? No. The systemic insecticide is for non-edibles. We wouldn't want to get that into leaves that we would be eating. Should you pinch lower leaves of tomatoes for stronger plants? Yes, there's some good reason for removing the lower leaves that would be touching the ground. Those are oftentimes the leaves that will start getting diseases first. See, many of the organisms that cause the diseases, fungi and bacteria, splash up from the soil. So they'll splash up from the soil onto the lower leaves, and then they get entrenched on the lower leaves. Then they skip from that leaf up to the next one. And so by pruning off the lowest leaves, you can remove that chance of inoculation onto those. So there's a good case for pinching off that lower set that is too close, especially if they're touching the soil. How often and what to use to fertilize annual flowers? Annual flowers, you could use a slow release fertilizer, or you could use a 10-10-10 granular, such as a flower bed. For pots, for any container flowers, I think the water soluble type works very well. It's readily available to the plants, and just has such a good safety margin as long as you're following directions. So potted flowers, I think, really respond well to every 2 weeks at least of water soluble type. Tell us about Garden Palooza this year. Uh, Yes, and Larry mentions that he did spinosad and was very successful on his apple trees in preventing insects. Garden Palooza this year, Yard and Garden Palooza, our all-day event, uh, is going to move to every other year. So our Yard and Garden Palooza will be next year instead of 2025. We're moving to every other year. Anyone who was registered for Yard and Garden Palooza last year, I'll be sending that notice shortly. Next year will be here before we know it. When is the best time to plant apple trees, and how can I ensure proper pollination? The best time to plant apple trees is probably in spring. They could be planted all summer long, but you may as well get them in spring so that they have the whole season to grow and root in and get your head start on the eventual years in which you're going to get fruit. And how can I ensure proper pollination? Apple trees do need two different varieties of apples. So a Honeycrisp and a Zestar. So it can't be too Honeycrisp. Flower and crab apples work. Now, usually in town, there's enough other apple trees and flower and crab apples. So in most town situations, the pollination is going to happen as long as the tree has gotten to an age where it's bearing fruit, 5 to 7 years. Some apple trees even take 9 years from planting. Um, where pollination is oftentimes a problem is on an isolated farmstead that's miles from the nearest, and then there you need two different apple trees. Now, there are a lot of things that affect pollination. Even though you've got different apple trees in the area, um, it can't be too hot, can't be too cold, can't be too cloudy. The bees need a certain regimen in order to be flying around. And so temperature, too hot, too cold, that can all affect the viability of the pollen also, and it affects the ability or the desire of the bees to travel. So there's a lot that kind of goes into pollination. Not much we can do about it other than making sure you have two trees. What is the best remedy for oleander aphids on swamp milkweed? I think on swamp milkweed, of course, we want to make sure that we're not going to be applying something when the monarch butterflies are. But I think I would probably use on aphids maybe neem oil or insecticidal soap, malathion works quite well on aphids, and malathion breaks down quite rapidly and doesn't have such a long residual. Okay, next, that's the chat. Now let's go to the gardening Q&A. When is this best time to trim branches on a mature birch tree? Okay, we mentioned that. Delay on birch tree pruning until the leaves have started to expand, otherwise they do bleed. Next question. I had snow on the mountain plants on the north and west side of the house, which had little sunshine. They did well and matured. What can I, what can I, what can I maybe replace them with? Which had little sunshine, did well and matured. What can I replace them with? If you'd like a ground cover on the shaded side, Ajuga does quite nice. Ajuga, Ajuga does quite well. Garden centers have that. That would be nice. Okay. If you cut the tops off of perennials in April, is that too early for bees and other pollinators? I wasn't sure what the timing was for this. Okay, if you recall, I mentioned that a case for leaving the tops on perennials is because our little native bees are probably nesting in those. Now, I asked an entomologist this very same question. I said, okay, in April, we need to get those tops off, but if the weather isn't warm, are those little bees still in there? And he said, they probably are. So when you cut off the tops of the perennials, don't go take them out to the landfill or in the compost site. Instead, cut them and go stick them behind the garage or somewhere on your property. That will allow the pollinating insects to emerge when the weather warms, and yet you'll be able to get the tops cut back. So cut them back whenever the time is right for you, but maybe go stick them behind the garage somewhere and give the insects time to hatch out. And by first part of June, those old dead tops should be free of bees. Yep. So a couple of questions on that. So yep. So when you cut those back in April, bees could still be hibernating. So put those tuck them in a safe spot somewhere. Do you recommend cutting back all varieties of ornamental grasses? I think so. Otherwise you just get, like I mentioned, such a haystack. Many of the ornamental grasses are native prairie grasses. And of course, that's where the wildfires would go across, the grass fires would go and essentially prune off all that old dry stuff for us. But we do it by cutting them back each year is how gardeners accomplish that. When do you divide phlox? They bloom during summer. So phlox would be divided, the tall garden phlox divided in early spring, just as they start a little bit of growth. What do you think about the product Tanglefoot for apple maggot? Yeah, no, Tanglefoot is a sticky substance that is used to put on apple maggot traps. Apple maggot traps are a red ball that you hang in a tree, and each tree should have probably at least 6 or 8 of them. And you can see those traps online, buy them online. And so you put the Tanglefoot on that red sticky ball, and the apple maggot flies think that's an apple, and they land on the sticky Tanglefoot and get trapped so they can't lay eggs on your apples. Okay, Larry, thank you again for mentioning that the spinosad was successful in apple maggot control. Okay, another question. Can I share the slides that you present? Sharing as a PDF. I will do my best to get that accomplished also. Does crabgrass preventer need to be watered into the lawn? Yes, crabgrass preventer is usually available as granules, and so it is spread onto the lawn, and it needs to be watered in. It needs to develop into a protective barrier at soil line so that when the crabgrass seedlings sprout, they're killed. And so it takes at least a quarter to a half an inch of moisture. That's why many people, if they can time it close to the 15th of April, and right before a rain would be ideal to water that on in. If we don't get rain, then we need to water it and apply quarter inch to half an inch. Now,
Well, tune into the lawn seminar. We'll tell a little more about crabgrass control in a couple of weeks. Can we print out this calendar? I do believe, especially if I send this out to all of you as a PDF, you'd be able to print out those. Should I fertilize raspberry plants starting in March or in May? Probably early May when the little growth is starting, or even late April. The fertilizer will be there ready for them when they start growth. So raspberry fertilizing uh, sometime during April or early May, but time that so that when they're starting growth, you give them some nutrition. Should all evergreens be pruned in spring or early summer? Evergreens generally are pruned when they've started some growth. It depends a little bit what type of evergreen, but that's why May and June are evergreen pruning months instead of earlier. The leaves do not fall off my apple tree. It is covered in brown leaves. Why has this happened? It's interesting. The reason that leaves drop off of a tree is because the twigs form what's called an abscission layer. The tree needs to get rid of those leaves so that they're getting ready for next year's crop of leaves next spring. So that abscission layer forms and it's a breakaway point. Okay, and that forms in response to lower temperatures in the fall, the shortening days, but sometimes on some trees, they don't form that breakaway point. And it can be the weather, can be the moisture, can be the temperature. Some trees are well known for them clinging on. Sometimes some disease situations can cause it. I think your apple tree is probably going to be okay. And what happens if those leaves don't fall off? The new buds just physically push those off. So usually they'll end up dropping in the spring just because they're going to get physically pushed off. Okay, I've heard about no mow May to help the bees that might be wintering. Is this okay to do? No. Most research universities have come out against no mow May. And here's the reason. No mow May, in theory, it's a good idea. But when we don't mow our lawns, they don't turn into a wildflower meadow with all these wonderful things that can nourish bees. When most of us don't mow our lawns, about the only thing that's blooming is dandelions. And although bees will visit dandelions, beekeepers and entomologists have shown that dandelion pollen and nectar is not the best source of pollen for bees. And what it does is it's really hard on lawn grass. I've had quite a number of people mention that they tried no mow May and never again, because when you let your lawn grow that tall and then try to shorten it back, it's really hard on the lawn. So it would be a good idea if our lawns would all of a sudden turn into this beautiful wildflower meadow, but unfortunately don't. And so no mow May isn't all that it was kind of hoped that it would be. Do you need to wait until the soil's 50 degrees to do crabgrass preventer? Yes. Um, Crabgrass starts to germinate when the soil temperature gets to between about 50 and 55 degrees. And it waits until we get that trigger of temperature and then it starts to sprout. If you put crabgrass preventer on too early, it can lose effectiveness. And if you put it on too late, then it's already sprouted and you're too late. So the way that I watch the soil temperature is to monitor, it's called end-on soil temperature, NDAWN, end-on, NDAWN. If you simply Google end-on soil temperature, there's reporting sites all over North Dakota and western Minnesota, and it will show you for your closest city what the soil temperature is. So you look at the soil temperature at about the 2 to 4 inches. And when that starts approaching 50 degrees, you should have your crabgrass preventer in place. And that is around April 15th, but it can depend on how early the spring comes. If you fertilize your lawn in fall, can you mulch your tomatoes in the summer with the grass clippings? Yes, if you fertilize your lawn in the fall, those that grass clipping mulch will be good for your tomatoes. Don't use weed and feed, and don't apply herbicide to your lawn clippings at that time. But yes, if you collect them in the fall of the year, that'll be a good product for mulch. Do you cut back hydrangeas? Depends on the type of hydrangea. The Annabelle type with the big white blossoms, they grow from generally the lower 6 inches or so. So hydrangeas, the Annabelle type, are cut back in early spring before much growth starts to around 6 inches above soil level. The other type of hydrangea, which have the big pyramid-shaped clusters of flower, called panicle type, those grow like normal shrubs. They don't die all the way back. They sprout out from the above ground portion. So you just trim those back a little bit. So, Nina, it depends on what type of hydrangea you have as to how much pruning it does. Why do only 1/3 of the buds on my panicle hydrangea open? Large flower heads form, but most buds do not open. Hydrangea are really sensitive to a couple things. Hydrangea means water loving, and so they need lots of moisture. Mulch helps, especially shredded bark mulch. So keep them much wetter than typical shrubs. Mulch them to keep the soil cool. And also, sometimes it just depends on the weather. The last 3 or 4 summers, we've had fairly intense heat in the middle of summer, and that's anti hydrangea bud opening. And so sometimes it's weather related that we can't do much about. But we can do is mulch and keep the moisture up good and hope that the temperatures are going to be a little more conducive to hydrangea. Should spreading yew evergreens be also pruned in May or June? Yes, the yew type evergreens, May is a good month, kind of about the time they've started some new growth, then that's the time to prune yews as well. I cannot seem to keep strawberries alive. Strawberries do usually need mulch over winter. Um, Not so much if we get good snow cover, but if we don't get good snow cover, they can oftentimes freeze out. So in early November, when there's a little bit of frost in the ground, try covering them. That's actually where the strawberries comes from, is because commercial growers usually do cover them with straw. Elderberry care. Elderberries are fully winter hardy. Check the garden centers for the hardiest types, and some have better fruit also than others. What works best to get rid of those black bugs on raspberries? Yeah, those black annoying bugs. Two names for the same insect, sap beetle or picnic beetle, a little black bug with two little tan dots on, and the organic insecticide called spinosad, and also malathion. Both have a very short interval between the time you spray and the time you can consume the fruit. They break down rapidly. So rotate between spinosad and malathion on those, and look at the label for the number of days between, and it's not many, between the time you spray and the time you can safely harvest those. But you cannot use a long residual type spray um, on those. Pruning raspberries totally to the ground in the spring depends on the type of raspberry. The But most raspberries, boy, we need to do a whole workshop on raspberry and fruit growing. Um, you can prune them totally to the ground in the spring if it's an ever-bearing type. The other type of raspberries, raspberry pruning is kind of complicated, I think. The other type of raspberries, you prune out the old canes meaning those that are brown and really kind of dead looking because they've already borne their crop and aren't going to bear again. So the fresher looking canes are the ones you keep to thin out. If you do a little bit of Googling on raspberry pruning, University of Minnesota has a great website. Raspberry pruning, University of Minnesota, a great kind of a picture tutorial on raspberry pruning. I have a rose branch I was able to root, maybe 6 inches right now. Awesome. What is the best way to to um, to transplant that? Can I do it in a pot? Yes. It can, now that it's rooted, you can put it into a pot, give it plenty of good light, and by end of May, you should have a good rose bush to plant. Last question. I would like to plant purple clover as a lawn or thyme. Pretty purple, although I believe thyme is not as nice to step on. All right. Um, Purple clover is good. The white Dutch clover is also very good. Creeping thyme is very borderline in hardiness for most of North Dakota and across into Minnesota. Creeping thyme does not last very long. It's definitely marginal in adaptability. And but clover, much more winter hardy. Um, Both clover and thyme don't like a whole lot of traffic on them. So even clover will tolerate some traffic, but they're best for areas where you're not continually walking. Otherwise, it does tend to crush them. So, well, thank you. I think we've reached the end. There are still 118 of you that have hung in till the bitter end. And I think we reached the end of the questions. I tried to hit them all. Well, thank you again very much for joining. I really enjoy these webinars, and I'll send you out the links for the registration. Next week is on container gardening, and then we've got one the following week after that on the basics of vegetable gardening. And of course, we're all of us, no matter what level of gardening we're at, we can always learn new things on vegetable gardening. And then the final one is on lawns, how to have a good lawn with less work and less inputs. And so thank you all very much for joining. I hope you enjoy these as much as I do. Thank you and have a very good evening. Thanks.